How's it going today, everybody? Today's video is to go over a really important point about Telemark bindings and a difference that a lot of people often don't recognize, and that's the difference between spring stiffness and activity or neutrality, depending on which way we're going to go. So I wanted give you a little explanation with a couple different examples of bindings and why this is important, because a lot of people think that activity or neutrality is also the stiffness of the binding. So to kind of start things off, I wanted to show you guys a spring cartridge. So this particular one is a black diamond cartridge from an 01 binding, 01, 02, or 03. They're all pretty similar. So, and also a compression spring from a G3 Targa. This particular one's a Targa Ascent, which was their touring binding, but they all use the same spring configuration. So another example might be in the 75 millimeter realm is the axle from 22 Designs. You can see their springs are back here. They're not actually enclosed like a Black Diamond or a G3, but they're more, just look like a normal spring would look. When you get to the NTN stuff, you're gonna see stuff like this where this is the Outlaw X from 22 Designs, and the spring is down here. It's a single spring in here, and then there's actually a smaller spring inside of it. And another example would be the spring on the Lynx, and Majo would also have something similar. I didn't bring one of those over, but it has multiple spring configurations like similar to this one as well. So when we're talking about the stiffness of a Telemark binding, it always comes from the spring. You might even remember, like in the old 75 millimeter bindings, this is a Olympus Mountain Gear TTS, but this is essentially more or less a Volet spring assembly in the back. Back in the day, when we had in early bindings like this, when you think we're like, let's go back to Volet hardwires, Volet 3-pin hardwires, things that use this kind of spring configuration. A lot of times what it was, you bought the binding, or you still can because some of these are available, but you buy the binding and the stiffness of the binding was just that. It's whatever you got and whatever came with that particular binding. One thing when the G3 Targa came out is they started offering multiple spring options. So you had on the G3, they would have a red, a silver, or a green, depending on the configuration you wanted. So green was the stiffest. It was their World Cup, and they had like I think it's called the All Mountain. I'm blanking on it right now, but the silver was the softest, the red was in the middle, and the green was the stiffest. And so you had options to change the stiffness of the spring configuration. 22 Designs axle is the same way. You can get a stock spring, or you can get what's called the stiffy spring. So this kind of leads into that. You can change the stiffness of the binding with these different spring options. Black Diamond was the same way. They offered a free flex, a mid stiff, or a ridiculously stiff, or the rid stiff, which is what I'm holding here, and that changed the stiffness of the binding. So now that we kind of understand stiffness, the next thing to understand is what we call activity. Activity is wholly determined by the pivot point of the binding. So first off, I want to kind of show you a boot in this scenario and kind of help you understand what we're talking about by pivot point. So pivot point is basically where the boot is pivoting on the binding and starting to engage the ball of the foot, okay? So when I'm in the shop and I'm talking to somebody, I like to use a pen or a Sharpie. I usually get down on the floor and kind of show people, you know, where the pivot point is in regards to the pen or the Sharpie. That way I can kind of demonstrate, and obviously this is a stiff boot, so it's not going to flex on the ball of a foot like a shoe would. But you can imagine, like, this is where it's pivoting from right here. Now, if the pivot point is forward towards the toe of the boot, it's actually going to be a more neutral feel, because what's happening is it allows the boot to come up further before it's engaging the springs, okay? So regardless if you have stiff springs or soft springs, the pivot point is affecting what some people think is this sensation of stiffness, but it's actually activity, okay? So now you see here, I'm pivoting up and it's gonna engage all the way to the front of the binding. As I pull the pivot point back, it's gonna engage the ball of the foot. So to kind of demonstrate it on my hand is if the pivot point's here, it's gonna engage right at this point. As I pull it back, I always like to show people the further back it is, it's almost engaging it more on the ball of the foot immediately, making it more active. It's actually doing some of the work for you. So to kind of go back to some of the bindings that we had, a G3 Targa has a fixed pivot point right here where the cable is. So as you can see, that's exactly where it's going to engage the ball of the foot, engage the boot to the toe of the binding, okay? So really this point doesn't have anything to do with how stiff this is, okay? This is obviously not going to flex, a stiffer spring is going to give you that sensation of stiffness, but it's not actually going to change the pivot point on the toe piece of the binding. Well, that's why G3 Targas tend to have a really neutral feel, what we call neutral. The pivot point's pretty far up on the toe piece, and it's actually giving this sensation of neutrality, essentially. And then people can kind of tweak what they want with the springs. What happened is we went, and this kind of goes, the 22 Designs model is a little bit different. And this dates back all the way to Russell Rainey, who actually created the hammerhead. And a lot of people don't know, but the whole idea of this pivot modulation, I guess you could call it, goes back even to the super loop, which is all the way back to probably late 80s, early 90s. And you actually have the ability to change the positions. The hammerhead is the most famous for this because the hammerhead had 5 positions. There was even an old 22 Design sticker that says, what's your favorite position? And everybody always knew if you were a hammerhead skier, you could say, I ski position 3, okay? So you can see maybe on the side of this, there's 3 holes. These are the 3 pivot positions. So first position is closer to the toe. Third position is going back towards the heel. So basically what's happening, there's a little pin that goes in here called a slick pin. And what it does is it changes where it's catching the cable right here. So by putting that little pin through here, it's stopping the cable at different positions, making it so the pivot point changes. Again, comes with a stock spring, but there's a stiffy spring. So if you're someone who wants a lot of activity, for instance, and you like a stiff binding, you can go with a stiffy spring and you'd probably ski it on position 3. But the cool part about this is it leaves all sorts of variations for you to actually change pivot point and stiffness in the binding. Now, when you get to some of the NTN bindings, funny enough, now we're in the 22 realm of NTN bindings, for instance, the pivot point's actually fixed on the Outlaw X, but you have the option of a stock or a stiffy spring. So right there, you've kind of got some options, and there's 5 settings of preload that can be changed on these springs to make adjustments. So there's like 5 different options on stock spring, 5 different options on the stiffy spring, giving a total of 10 options, and you don't have the ability to change the pivot point. Still quite a bit of changes. The Majo binding, again, I don't have one here in front of me. That has a fixed pivot point as well, but it offers a single spring configuration, a double spring configuration, a red spring, which is their like super ridiculously stiff spring, and I believe you can even go one more and put the small spring inside of the larger one and achieve even another 5 settings on those. So it's pretty cool. So you're starting to see hopefully that there's a lot of options in terms of spring tension, but only some of the bindings have both spring and pivot point. One thing 22 Designs did when they built the Lynx, for instance, is they actually went back to including the 3 pivot points with the slick pin, and you can adjust those. What's different about this in terms of the spring, and you can always watch our overview video of this particular binding, but they actually used a spacer, and there's an option for 2 spacers on the large. And what the spacer does is actually create preload on the spring. So similar concept to being able to adjust it. It's just that it's a fixed thing rather than something you're adjusting by hand. And that's that. So the point of this video really is just to teach you that there's a difference between activity and neutrality that's determined by the pivot point, and that stiffness is really caused more by the spring than the pivot point. And there's obviously some ability to have a combination of both things. But a lot of times pivot point gets confused for stiffness of the binding. So next time you're choosing a binding, make sure that you're kind of understanding the concepts of adjustable pivot point, fixed pivot point, what kind of binding that fits your style the best. And then you can kind of adjust with the different spring tensions and spring options depending on which binding you're going with. So hopefully that was helpful, you guys. Thanks for checking out the video. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel. And we always love doing these videos, so you can send in questions to us at the shop, and we're always happy to answer them online. Thanks a lot. Until next time, spread Telemark always.